Now, there are other reasons too, because this is a multifaceted phenomenon. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting about human females is that they're selective maters. Now, chimp females are not selective maters, and what that means is that the dominant males still have most of the offspring, but the reason for that, apparently, is because they chase the subordinate males away from sexually receptive females. Although the sexually receptive females will sneak off behind a rock somewhere and mate with a subordinate male. But as long as the dominant male is around, the probability of that is quite low. So that the female chimps aren't sexually selective. Whereas human females have concealed ovulation so that no one knows when they're at their most fertile, and they're selective maters. And women in every society virtually that's ever been studied have a typical pattern of behavior, which is that if you look at the female dominance hierarchy and you look at the male dominance hierarchy, the females will mate across and up dominance hierarchies, and the males will mate across and down, which works fine for both genders because their interests align. But it also means that, in all likelihood, that women have exerted tremendous sexual selection pressure on men. And that might be part of the reason, of the many reasons that we actually, the theory is that the common ancestor between chimps and humans was a lot more like a modern chimp, than like a modern human. So for whatever reason, we've undergone a lot more transformation in the last 7 million years than chimps have. And one possible reason for that, and I think it's a highly probable reason, is that sexual selection operated a lot more viciously, so to speak, among humans. It's operated to the point where you have twice as many female ancestors as male. And you might think, well, that can't be possible, but here's how it's possible. It's like only every second man had a child. Well, all women had one. Now, of course, that isn't what happened. But on average, that's what happened. So the proportion of men who are completely childless in any given generation is far higher than the proportion of women who are. So you see an element of expendability in males, and that's typical across the biological community because you don't need as many males as you need females in order to keep the population moving forward. And one of the things that happens as a consequence of that, at least in principle, is that males are more behaviorally variable and variable across a lot of dimensions than females are. And that's a plus because they're more variable on the upside, but it's also a negative because they're more prevalent on the downside. So now there's substantial argument about that in relationship to people, what the actual implications are of that for human beings. One potential implication is that although women and men have equivalent IQs, the standard deviation is slightly different, which means that there are more males who are intellectually impaired, but there are also more males who are 4 and 5 standard deviations above the population mean. You don't need much of a difference in standard deviation in order to produce radical differences at the extreme. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Males are more aggressive than females among humans, but the effect is only about half a standard deviation. And so what that means is that if you take two females, a female and a male, randomly from a population, and you were trying to guess who was the more aggressive of the two, most of the time, about 60% of the time, the male would be more aggressive than the female, but 40% of the time it would be reversed. So, that's a lot of overlap. But then here's the rub. So let's say, just for example, that among the population of men and women combined, only the most aggressive person out of 100 ends up in jail. Those are all men. Because that tilt towards aggression is enough so that if you go way out on the distribution, the only people who are that extreme are men, even though the population difference isn't that great. So anyways, there's a massive debate in the relevant literature about the potential consequences of that for things like cognitive function, because there's some indication as well that men are more cognitively specialized, but women are more cognitively robust. And so, anyways, it doesn't really matter. But what does matter is the fact of this permanent dominance hierarchy. Now, the dominance hierarchy also has the male dominance hierarchy also has another feature. So we already said that, on average, men are half as likely to leave offspring as women are. And so what that means is that, all things considered, I'm not trying to make this into a circular argument, Because I could say it's the more successful males that leave offspring, but then you'd say, well, that's a definition, Darwinian definition of success. But I don't mean Darwinian success, because that's self-evident. What I mean is that if you look in the modern world, for example, and you try to predict number of available sexual partners for a given male, your best predictive measure of that is income. And the best predictive measure of that is intelligence and conscientiousness. And so what happens is that males orient themselves in groups, and then they compete. And then women peel off the top. And so the women are in a position of judgment on men, and the judgment is the judgment of nature. Now, from a Darwinian perspective, when we think of nature, we think of like it depends on who you are, but like if you're an environmentalist, you think of a French Impressionist landscape, forgetting that nature is also malarial mosquitoes and cancer and all those, and rats infected with bubonic plague and all those other lovely things. But from a Darwinian perspective, you can define nature much more straightforwardly and more accurately as that which selects. Now, you hear a lot about natural selection. And natural selection basically assumes that there are a random distribution of alterations in genetic structure in any population, in any generation. And some of those random alterations will be more suited to that particular environment. Suited being they'll live and they'll reproduce. And genetic transformation takes place across the millennia as the organism chases the landscape, roughly speaking. But Darwin, who is an unbelievably intelligent person, was also very, very interested in sexual selection. And as far as Darwin was concerned, sexual selection was just as powerful a force in modifying genetic structure, modifying or driving evolution as natural selection. And that's been very underplayed by biologists, and that's only started to switch maybe in the last, I would say, it hasn't switched that much yet, but it only really started to switch probably in about the last 25 years. And that's because the idea of sexual selection makes things a hell of a lot more complicated. Because, well, first of all, in the standard Darwinian account of evolution, there's no place for mind, right? There's no place for a creator. There's no place for teleology, and teleology is something moving towards an end, a goal, right? But the thing is, if sexual selection is operative, and if consciousness is ancient, then mind has been operating through sexual selection as long as there's been sexual selection. I mean, so you think, do you have any choice, do you make any choice in who your partner will be, a sexual partner will be? And the answer to that is, well, it's hardly random. You make a choice. And what's interesting is that, if you take 60 people, let's say if you took 60 women and you asked them, you showed them a bunch of men and you asked them to rank them in terms of their attractiveness, there's going to be fairly consistent rankings. We know what makes up attractive facial features for women and for men. It's easy to determine that. What you do is you take 60 faces and you average the features. So you don't get the average person, because the average person is more like a median. You get the averaged person. And the average person has perfectly symmetrical features that are nicely shaped and fairly big eyes, and they're very nice looking. They're very attractive. And so that means that there's like a central human form, in a sense, that we find attractive. And we see this in other species. For example, there are butterflies who won't mate with another butterfly if it's like a 1/16 of an inch out of symmetry, because then it's not a butterfly of that type. And that's how people think too, is the more you deviate from the averaged person, the less canonically human you appear, and the less attractive that you appear. And so, we're chasing this ideal, in some sense, that's an emergent property of the nature of our species. And then, there are certain physical characteristics, wide shoulders in men and narrow waist. In women, its waist-to-hip ratio is a very common marker of beauty across cultures and across body types, interestingly enough. So if you take thin women and heavier women and you get men to rate the attractiveness of the women within that category, the heavy women and the light women who have a waist-to-hip ratio of about 0.68 are the ones that are judged most attractive physically. And so, and that actually correlates, by the way, with fertility, because the abdominal fat in a young woman is a sign of ill health and also a marker of decreased likelihood of conception. Now, none of this is operating consciously, obviously. It's deeply wired into us. It's part of our immediate perception. But it still does indicate that there is an ideal, like a Platonic ideal, lurking at the back of our minds against whom we compare everyone that we meet. And then you might say, well, what's the nature of that Platonic ideal? And that's a very, very complicated question. You know, I would say that you could almost literally claim that you can certainly claim that the ideal male is represented in mythology as a hero. So, and that's actually what mythology is about. It's about representing ideal patterns of behavior. So it's hardly surprising. And so, you know, if you go to a movie and it's a romance, and there's the main lead character that you're supposed to fall in love with, if you happen to be the kind of person that would fall in love with that kind of person, then he's going to act out a particular pattern of behavior. And the pattern of behavior is quite identifiable. So, for example, he's going to move forward and explore and not hide and cower. And the probability that he's going to be creative is very high, and the probability that he's going to be good-looking and strong is very high. And so, those are archetypal features. And those aren't all the archetypal features, because those are, in some sense, those are the self-evident ones. But, you know, people are also evaluating each other for such things as intelligence and personality and character. And you could say in some sense the men are competing to be the best man, and the women are watching the male competition to take the man who wins on the presupposition that he wouldn't win if he wasn't the best man. It's a very, very intelligent strategy, you know, because why not outsource the problem? You let the men sort it out. Well, it's too cognitively complex to compute. You could say that the male dominance hierarchy is equivalent to the stock market. It's exactly equivalent to the stock market. Like the stocks are always competing with one another and with every other commodity for primacy of price and value, and that's exactly what happens with male competition. That dominant structure is typically represented as masculine. And I think the reason for that, although I'm not absolutely certain of this, I think the reason for that is that our social hierarchies are probably more like chimp social hierarchies than they are like bonobo social hierarchies. So the bonobos are a kind of a strange breed of chimps. I don't know how many of you know about them, but the bonobos are extraordinarily sexual, and they use sex pretty much as a standard means of communication and tension reduction. And there's a lot of sex between the females in the bonobo troops, and the use of sex seems to bond them together in a way that keeps male aggression under control, which is quite interesting. And so, but in the chimps, the fundamental dominance hierarchy is male, although there's a female dominance hierarchy as well, and some females can certainly be more dominant than some males, but the fundamental structure seems to be male. And then I would also say, well, it's probably dependent to some degree in the primate community and in other social animals on other factors. So we know, for example, that the gender that has the highest level of testosterone tends to be the dominant gender. And so in hyenas, the females have higher levels of testosterone. They're actually bigger and more aggressive than the males, and the price they pay for that is that they have to give birth through a structure that's very much like a penis, which is not the world's most pleasant experience and might account for the hyena's temper. So, but in human beings, you know, you see sexual dimorphism. Men are slightly bigger than women, and that's also generally characteristic of creatures that have a dominance hierarchy that's tilted towards masculine. And then the other factor seems to be that human beings have our infants have very, 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 very long periods of dependence, and it's very difficult to maneuver your way doing anything, really, especially anything that has to do with competition and power, if you're taking care of, you know, one infant, let alone 3. And so it seems to me that those are all valid reasons why the primary power structures among human beings have typically been male, and why they're represented as masculine. Notion. Okay, so back to sexual selection. Now, we already talked about the fact that biologists perhaps were uncomfortable with the idea of sexual selection because it brings a non-random factor into evolution, a seriously non-random factor, because you have to go back as far as you can in history to where there was no choice on the part of the organism to attribute evolution to natural selection alone. And you have to go a long ways back. As I said, even butterflies are perfectly capable of distinguishing between a high-quality butterfly partner, in butterfly terms, and a low-quality butterfly partner. And you know, that insects have been around for a very, very long time. So we have no idea what that actually means, is that we have no idea what role choice has made in the evolutionary process. But one thing that you can infer is that the reason that human beings are the way they are now and not like our chimp/human ancestor is because the sexual selection process got started, and it was intense. And so as a consequence of that, well, here we are. And so, you know, maybe it was a good thing, although it's very hard in some sense on all those people who failed. And that's, you know, roughly speaking, twice as many men as women. So, you know, so then that also raises the question, like, who's responsible for the male dominance hierarchy? Because you could say, well, it's male competitiveness, but you could also say, yeah, well, it's an inevitable function of female selection. And so, which is not an argument that you hear very often. But I think it's a very difficult argument to escape from. And that leads us to our next hypothesis. So we're going to say, well, the masculine dominance hierarchy is represented as masculine. I'm going to call that the Great Father for the time being. And that's the permanent dominance hierarchy of men. And it's always there. It moves through history. It's different men all the time. But it's like the men slot in and out as they are born and die, but the structure itself stays intact across forever. It's always there. It's been there at least for millions of years. So for our purposes, we'll just call it permanent. It's a permanent part of experience. And it's a big part of it. And, you know, as culture gets more and more, covers larger and larger expanses of territory and gets more and more sophisticated, it's an ever larger part of reality. So, I mean, most of us spend almost all our time coping with the dominance hierarchy and almost none of our time combating nature. You know, you get wet, and today you get wet for a little while and that's it, you know, but most of the problems that you would face in a purely natural environment, it's like you're so distant from them that you can hardly even imagine. You can't even imagine what it would be like, in some sense, to be in an environment like that. Anyways, so back to sexual selection and the power hierarchy. Now, from a Darwinian perspective, one of the things that you might do is call whatever selects nature. And so when we think of nature, and when we think about nature from a scientific perspective, we don't ever think about humans as agents of nature, right? We tend to conceive of the human being as something that stands against nature, right? That's a mythology. It's like the human being against the natural world. It's a very common plot in movies and in stories. So it's man against nature, roughly speaking. So we tend to think of those as separate categories. But if women do the selection among human beings, at least they do the intense selection, then women are nature for men. And that's exactly what the archetype is. It's Mother Nature. And Mother Nature has a very vicious element. And the vicious element of Mother Nature is rejection. And that can be maternal rejection, which is, you know, certainly something that causes a tremendous amount of trauma. But it can also be the most fundamental form of rejection, and the most fundamental form of rejection is sexual rejection. Because it means that you are judged as biologically unworthy, roughly speaking. So, and there's other reasons why. So the reason I'm telling you this is because I've been trying to puzzle out what you see in mythology quite clearly is that the dominance hierarchy is represented as male, so culture is male, and nature is female. I thought, why the hell would nature be female? It's like, okay, well, I've given you one reason, and I think it's the primary reason. There's other reasons, because nature is also seen as that which produces natural forms. Of course, women produce natural forms, so that's a logical association.